Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today is a time to be grateful for all that God has done in our lives, and a time to remember not to take anything for granted, not a single gift, or any person, or even one moment in time. For when God gives it, it is precious. Help us, Lord. Help us, Lord, to honor those who have given the ultimate gift of self for you or for others. We especially pray for those who give their lives to you as priests or religious, as well as those who have sacrificed their lives for others as veterans. We pray that other people might learn from their examples and learn to give more of themselves. Help us to do this through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to be shining examples of the living gift himself. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, so we have returned this week. This week we have returned, and we're talking about sort of a large swath of time. Basically, we're looking at from what's often called the Tridentine period of church history, what's happening sort of after the Council of Trent, but before Vatican I happens. In particular, this week we're going to look at what's happening outside the church. So not the politics inside the church, not what's being debated inside the church, but sort of the things the church is dealing with outside of it. Right? What are the politics of Europe, of the world the church is dealing with here? So I've broken this up, and then next week we'll do sort of what's the internal politics of the church, of the Counter-Reformation up through that. So I've broken this up into 3 different periods of time, and then by country. So 1540, this is about when the Council of Trent is starting to be assembled. Again, the Council of Trent was called to try to deal with Protestantism. How are we going to reconcile the church to the Protestant Reformation? Are we going to try to get the Protestants back into the church? Are we just going to chop them off and let them go on their way? What's the deal? The Council of Trent is trying to solve this. Until 1648, which is when the Treaty of Westphalia is signed. So from basically from the 95 Theses until the Treaty of Westphalia, what you have in Europe is different countries fighting each other over the Catholic-Protestant issue, but then you also have civil wars happening within each of the countries in Europe over the Catholic-Protestant issue. All right, because it's kind of easy for people to be like, oh, well, they're fighting about religion. That's kind of dumb. Well, you also have to remember that the way most people are thinking about this today is different from the way most people thought about it then. And you can't necessarily say that these people are dumb, because the logic behind a religious conflict here is actually not like out of the realm of logic. It's think of it this way: if the most important thing is your soul, because your soul is eternal and your body is temporary, then what's more important? Nothing. Right? The whole thing here is that religion was also seen not as a personal choice at this time. Religion was seen as something that was also part of a community. And that how could you possibly expect to raise your children in the true faith if your next door neighbor is not also believing this is the true faith? Isn't that just going to make it easier for your children to become corrupted? Isn't that just going to make it easier for your family members to fall away from the faith? And now all of a sudden, you've got a whole bunch of people, you've got more roadblocks to their salvation. Right? The more religious diversity, the more roadblocks there are to individual salvation. If you're a country that permits this, then what you're doing is you're basically admitting that you don't care about people's souls. How crappy a government is that? Right? So this is kind of the way people thought about it. So first you've got the spiritual thing going on here, right? This is a struggle over right order in the universe. Like there's nothing there. One could argue there's no, like when Pope Urban II calls the First Crusade back in the 1000s, he says you guys would be fighting wars anyway, but you'd be fighting wars over money, power, land. How dumb is that? If you're going to fight a war over something, it might as well be over right order in the universe. It might as well be over something selfless, like, trying to unite yourselves to the one perfect being or something like that, right? So that's something we see here a lot. Also, this is also tied up into political legitimacy, right? This is a time when you've got kings, because of Philip IV, successfully taking on Boniface VIII. You now have kings starting to claim a direct divine right from God to rule. That bypasses the church. So, if you have somebody who is saying, no, we don't assent to your particular religion, Mr. King, then that was widely seen as an act of treason. Right? If you don't have the same religious view on this as the king, then you've basically undermined the whole legitimacy of your government in the first place. Why would you listen to a government that has a diametrically opposed view of how God is supposed to do things? Right? It sort of undermines the political legitimacy of the government. So if it's a Catholic country and you've got a whole bunch of Protestants, like everyone at the time would have said, "Wow, Protestants are treasonous." Right? Or vice versa. If you had a Protestant principality and there were still Catholics that hadn't converted, that was considered a political statement against the change in regime. Right? So if you were in an area in which not everyone was looking the same way on religious matters, like you couldn't both be equally right. One of you had to be more right. We need to determine which is more right. Whoever is less right is just creating an obstacle for people's salvation. Right? And whoever's holding out is also making a political statement.
That happened right here in Maryland.
Yes.
Amen.
So, in 1648, this series of Catholic-Protestant wars ends when the 30 Years' War comes to an end. And the European princes and kings get together and they have a treaty called the Treaty of Westphalia, where they agree to the principle that cuius regio ius religio, which means the religion of the prince is the religion of the land. So the idea is that whoever controls the government gets to decide who the religion is. Okay? So if your king is Catholic, Protestants, by treaty, all the Protestant kings are agreeing not to try to undermine the Catholic king. If you've got a Protestant king or prince, the Catholic countries by treaty have agreed not to try to overthrow the Protestant prince or king. And this is the principle that sort of brings an end to the 30 Years' War, which was the last, major war that had a religious justification, a direct religious justification. And this is the Treaty of Westphalia. So we'll first be looking at the calling of the Council of Trent to the Peace of Westphalia, which basically ends with the kings of Europe basically signing a treaty over the church's objections that whoever controls the government gets to decide what the religion is in your country. We'll then go from Westphalia to 1820, so Westphalia until 5 years after the defeat of Napoleon, with the French Revolution and the French revolutionary ideas being spread all over Europe. And then we'll go to right after 5 years after Napoleon until the calling of Vatican I. And we're going to be looking at the external politics. Today's handout is something that we're going to talk about more next class, but it will be helpful for understanding the dispute between the Church and the King of Spain. And this is Pope Paul III's papal bull here condemning the enslavement of Indians. So that's an English translation right there. So Pope Paul III is also the Pope that organizes the Council of Trent. And he actually, there's a major dispute here between the church and the King of Spain as to whether or not the Indians are rational beings or whether or not they are human-looking animals. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the dispute. I'll talk about it a lot next class, but I'll touch on it a little bit here. Okay, so what is happening in France from 1540 to 1648? Surely nothing good from the church's point of view. First off, you've got the King of France still claiming a divine right to rule France. A divine right that then, in fact, makes the king, puts the king over the church. So the King of France is still claiming a divine right to rule France that circumvents the church. It's a direct divine right he's claiming. Now, if he has a direct divine right, then this means that the church, the King of France, is trying to make it so that the church is operating underneath the rules of the king. Right? It's not separate but equal. It's not the church claiming to be able to replace the king at will. It's the king trying to subordinate the church to his direct divine right to rule. So the church is dealing with this in France. Right? They lost this argument when Boniface VIII was basically assassinated by King Philip IV's troops, and they had not recovered that as of this point. They had not recovered that argument. Now, France, for political reasons, okay, everyone know like where France is, right? Okay, all right. So, what are the two countries that border France, essentially, that would have bordered France on either side at this time? Spain and Germany. So, France, so at this time, Spain and France have Habsburg family people that have ascended to the thrones in both of those places. So the same dynasty that controls, the same dynasty controls Germany and Austria and Spain. So France sees itself as having a massive national security threat here. You've got one dynasty controlling things on both sides of it. So France is looking for opportunities to try to weaken Spain and Germany for their own national security reasons. So France is engaging in a policy that will try to weaken both Germany and also Spain. So when the Protestant Reformation breaks out, France, you would think, France, it's the Catholic, it's one of the major Catholic monarchies. Surely they're going to side with the Pope here and, try to quell Protestantism. No, as a matter of fact, the French government does everything it can to try to egg on the Protestants. Right? As a matter of fact, Cardinal Richelieu is one of the major figures in France here, during the 30 Years' War. And Richelieu actually engages in a policy where he actually gives money and weapons to German Protestants to fight against the Habsburgs.
He was a little bit of a stinker anyway.
Yeah. And, so that's one thing that's happening here in France. The French are not trying to do a whole lot to stop Protestantism because they see this as a convenient way of undermining the Habsburgs in Germany and then also in Spain. Let's see.
Beg your pardon.
Yes, sure.
Towards the end and around Richelieu, that was when John Francis Regis was around.
Yeah.
And they just finished killing off thousands, millions of Calvinists in France as a means for them to gain power.
Well, yeah, in France, but not in Germany and not in Spain and not anywhere else.
I'm saying right there.
Oh yeah, but notice here once again, divine right of kings. Right? If you've got Protestants in France, that's a national security problem for you. You don't want Protestants in France, but you want those Protestants in Germany. Right? So the King of France here is not really doing anything, he's cracking down on Protestants in France, but he's not really doing it. He's doing it because he thinks they're national. He's trying to drive them into Switzerland, and there are even times where the King of France actually, He actually had like a voucher program where if you were a Calvinist and you willingly moved to Germany, like he would give you money to move back to Germany to create more problems for the Germans. So this is happening in France. So when the Council of Trent is called, you know, a lot of the other kings of Europe that have Protestants, they're like, okay, let's try to, you know, let's not just talk about theology, let's deal with the administrative problems in the church that, you know, need to be fixed. What does the King of France do? He says, let's talk about theology. Let's talk about all the theological problems that we need to address. That were, you know, much less likely to get addressed during the Council of Trent. Right? If there was going to be, everyone agreed that what the administrative problems were. People just had different solutions to the administrative problems. The theological problems, a lot harder to address. You know, is it sola scriptura or scriptura and tradition? You know, is it sola fide or faith and actions? A lot harder to address those. You know, it's kind of like somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose on that. Okay, so that's happened in France. In Spain, oh Spain. So in Spain, you're now also dealing with the divine right of kings. The church is. Okay, hold on. Yeah, I'll go back to that. Okay, so in particular, you're dealing with the King of Spain has nationalized the Inquisition, which had previously been under the jurisdiction of the church, and, you know, wasn't killing anybody. And then now you've got, starting with Ferdinand and Isabella, and then continuing on to Charles V and Philip II, the inquisitors are now being appointed by the King of Spain, rather than the Bishop of Toledo or by the Pope. So you've got this whole thing where the Inquisition is sort of now going after people that the King of Spain wants him to go after, rather than trying to figure out, you know, who needs impartial legal decisions, which is their original purpose. So the Inquisition is now sort of being run off the rails by the King of Spain, and the popes are like, no, stop appointing inquisitors. And they're like, no, this is how we can get rid of our political opponents. So that's the problem. There's the New World that the Spanish are big into at this time. And then there's this issue of Indian rights. You know, they had a series of major debates in Spain at this time. There was, so, coming back from the New World, there were basically two types of conflicting reports that the Spanish would give. There were some Spaniards who would go to the New World and say, look, there are these rational beings over here that, you know, have civilization and things like this, and, you know, we don't agree with a lot of their practices. We think they're kind of barbaric, but you know what? They're reformable and we can convert them. There are also reports coming back from other Spaniards who've been in the New World saying that there are animalistic barbarians who like, you know, kill their young, you know, when it suits them, and who engage in human sacrifice to please, you know, some other like natural deity or something like that. Really, are we going to call these people human beings? That seems kind of, you know, off the rails. So there are these two conflicting reports coming back to Europe, and, you know, the King of Spain is sort of saying, well, you know, I'm receiving two conflicting reports. You know, you guys can duke it out. We'll see what happens. Now, Pope Paul III ends up having sort of the two big Spanish advocates for either side come and debate in front of him, and they sell tickets. Like there were a series of debates between the two guys that were called to debate whether or not the Indians were human beings or whether they were animals. Pope Paul III had them come and debate. They sold tickets. A series of debates. Bartolomé de las Casas was the Spanish priest who was arguing in favor of the Indians being rational beings, that, you know, deserving of human rights, etc., etc. Whereas Juan Gines de Sepúlveda was the Spanish theologian who was arguing the case against the humanity of the natives. And, you know, Las Casas would say, well, look, you know, they have the form of human beings. They have religion. If you have religion, that presumes that you're a rational being. You know, they're doing cut your heart out human sacrifice. That's not good religion, but, you know, it still shows that they're rational beings. You know, they have families, things like this. You know, things that, you know, you wouldn't expect a cow or something like that to have. And Sepulveda, on the other hand, would argue that, you know, these natives here, they're, you know, like they, you know, some of the native tribes are engaging in cannibalism. You know, that's something that we don't really associate with human beings. You know, like, you know, animals will often eat each other, but human beings will not, you know, eat each other. Let's see. You know, Sepulveda argues that just because you have the form of a human being doesn't mean that you are, like, you can look like, you can have, like, he argues, for example, that, you know, all animals have 4 limbs, right? So just because you have 4 limbs, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a human being, right? That, you know, cows have 4 limbs and a head, and cows have a stomach and a heart and brain, right? So that doesn't necessarily, so your form by itself does not necessarily mean that you're a human being, Sepulveda argues. Las Casas says, well, you know, it's form and also these other spiritual things that we can see them doing. Sepulveda would say, you know, like, how could you possibly say that those are spiritual things? Those are, like, you know, barbaric animalistic practices. Anyway, so what ends up happening is the King of Spain accepts Sepulveda's argument, but Paul III accepts Las Casas' argument. Yes?
I mean, were these really theological debates, or was the fact that there was a lot of gold there kind of biasing there?
Well, what I will say is that I will say that the Spanish government was, the Spanish government certainly had mixed motives, because on the one hand, they repeatedly say that, they repeatedly refer to this as a win-win, you know. Yes, we're making Spain better, but on the other hand, look at all the people we can now save. So like whenever you look at primary documents from the King of Spain, the Spanish government is always saying, like, look, it's a win-win. You know, it's good for Spain and it's good for humanity. You know, and that's sort of the argument they make. They never make the religious argument without making the secular argument. They never make the secular argument without making the religious argument either. Now, from Pope Paul III's stance, sure, the church might benefit indirectly if gold is discovered or things like this. But if you look at the academic debate between Las Casas and Sepulveda, you know, neither one of these guys were necessarily shills of the Spanish government, right? I mean, they were both in the New World. They had both seen basically the same stuff. It is true that there would be, like, Las Casas certainly is arguing from a theological standpoint. Sepulveda, it's a little bit more debatable, because if you wanted to enslave a whole bunch of natives, then Sepulveda's argument is very convenient. That being said, it's an open question as to whether or not Sepulveda is like, you know, if I went into the New World and I saw a whole bunch of people that, like, practiced cannibalism and cut the hearts out of people, you know, like, my initial conclusion would be like, what? You know, that's not a human thing to do. I mean, like, I might have a similar reaction to that. The question is, you know, like, how much of this is Sepulveda really concerned about the theological merits of something, and how much is Sepulveda, like, buttering the bread and justifying what the Spanish government was doing. But no, they had a series of academic, so, like, but all of his stated arguments are theological arguments. They're all, like, very nice, logical, philosophical arguments. Yeah. Okay. So that's Las Casas versus Sepulveda. So the church here is in the New World. So in 1540, Pope Paul III says, you can't enslave the natives. I've decided they're rational beings, siding with Las Casas. Spanish government says, okay, well, you made your decision, try to enforce it now. Now the Spanish crown is siding with Sepulveda. So that's a really political issue that you have with, you know, so anyone ever seen the movie The Mission? Yeah. Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. That's a very good movie. That takes place in the 1700s, but it's a very good movie that shows the divide here between how the church understands the natives in the New World and how the Spanish government is understanding them. Because as a result of this bull, Pope Paul III bans Catholics from practicing the slave trade. But as you know, as late as the 1800s, the Spanish crown received a hell of a lot of tax revenue from the trafficking of slaves. But the Spanish government always claimed that the Spanish government always claimed that under the laws of Spain, slavery was illegal, and that those people were acting outside of Spanish law. That being said, the Spanish government never really cracked down on slave traders they could have very easily cracked down on. So it's really more the Spanish government looking the other way on slave trading when, according to the letter of the law, slavery had been illegal in Spain as long as the church, ever since the church had put this bull down on it. So the church is like constantly lobbying Spain. You got to knock this off. Why aren't you enforcing this more? We said you can't be a Christian and traffic in a slave trade. No, really, we're working on it. Okay. Now, Spain also is interesting here because Spain was one of the few countries that didn't really face much of penetration from Protestantism. So Spain, of all the countries, was actually the one that was most willing to put up resources to fight Protestantism and resolve Protestantism. However, Spain also clearly has ulterior motives. So Spain, of all these countries, Spain is really the only one that is willing to put up, the only government willing to put up resources to try to reconcile the Protestants one way or another. That being said, Spain is also saying like, okay, we'd be happy to help out the, the French with their Protestantism problem. Just let us send a few thousand troops into France. We'd be happy to help you out. Right, and the French would be like, well, no, we don't want Spanish troops on our soil. This is obviously a power grab by the Spanish. Right? So lots of other countries are not willing to work with the Spanish, and the Pope himself doesn't know if he can doesn't really know if he can trust the Spanish kings with sending out resources to try to stop the Protestants. Right? Because he already knows he can't trust them on the Inquisition, and he already knows he can't trust them on the New World. So how can you trust them with the Spanish sending troops all over Europe, right? And of course, France likes this because the more Spain sends troops everywhere, the more extended they're getting. The fewer troops they can have to pressure the French to do things. So the French are really like egging on the Spanish. No, really, come on. There are more Protestants in England now to fight. No, send an armada up to England, please. English are making us a little bit worried. Right. So, Spain.
They're trying to weaken Spain.
Yes. So, England. Well, starting in 1530s, you of course have Henry VIII going into schism with the church. But he goes into schism without embracing Protestant theology. Like so think of Henry as he's in schism with the church over the marriage issue, but at the same time he condemns Lutheran and Calvinist theology. So Henry VIII sort of thinks he's found a middle way. He's like, look, we're going to have basically a non-Roman Catholic church. A Catholic church that's, not united to Rome, essentially. So that's what Henry VIII has. Then, of course, Henry VIII dies, and his sickly young son, I think Edward V or Edward VI, he, of course, had been educated by Calvinists. So he comes to power, and the serious Reformation starts under Edward V. However, Edward V is sickly and is not around that long, so he dies, and Henry VIII's oldest daughter, Mary I, becomes queen. And Mary, of course, then, illegalizes Protestantism, and her administration starts burning Protestants who won't come back to the church for fun. Although I will say, a quick little defense of Mary Tudor herself here. Everything that I've read on this would seem to indicate that she did not expect that would happen. A lot of what happened was that during the reign of Henry VIII and Edward V, when you had lots of Catholics that would not assent to the marriage, like St. Thomas More, unlike St. Thomas More, most of them just said, okay, fine, we'll become Anglican, and then they would have like a closet where they would hide priests, and there was like an underground railroad of priests. And most Catholics in England really resented Henry VIII and Edward V doing this to them. So when Mary Tudor comes back, there's then like, the Catholics are back, and now all the closeted Catholics came out, and they wanted revenge against the big Protestants that were coming out and taking them on. So who was going to be in Mary's cabinet, if you will? People who had been closet Catholics under Henry VIII, under her father and her brother. So most of the people that filled Mary Tudor's administration were people that wanted revenge on the Protestants for killing members of their family, for making them hide out underground or threat of death. So Mary Tudor herself, I would say, was probably very shocked to discover that like her administration was doing. Like she everything I've read seems to indicate that she thought Protestants like should be chastised in some way, but like not with the fires of Smithfield. So Mary then, of course, dies childless, and now you get Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth I, she sort of puts her foot down and says, no, we're Protestant. And England is sort of, was officially a Protestant country ever since Elizabeth I. So after Elizabeth I, they have one more Catholic king, a king that's Catholic, but he does not change the official religion back to Catholicism. So Elizabeth I then is, when she does this, when she breaks with her sister's policy, she is excommunicated by Pope Pius V. In response to this, so notice here, in response to an excommunication, Elizabeth then launches a war on terror against Catholics in England.
That's an awful lot of Catholics.
So Elizabeth I, after she's excommunicated by Pope Pius V, she then like really cracks down on Catholics in England. You know, she sends, you know, like she has this, I guess under Lord Burleigh, he had a series of like an intelligence agency, a primitive intelligence agency that would go from town to town and scope out who might be in the priest smuggling rings, and then he would denounce them and have them executed. So there's very much a sort of war on terror here with Elizabeth. Elizabeth then dies, and James I becomes king. James I was the great-grandson of one of Henry VIII's sisters, and he had been king of Scotland. So he comes down from Scotland to England, and he is very much, his views on religion are very similar to Henry VIII's, like very high church Anglican kind of views. The King James Bible comes from James I. That's sort of the standard text that Protestants will use today. So James I becomes king, and he reigns until the early 1600s, and James is very high church Anglican in his views. Now it'll be his son Charles I that the English Civil War is fought over. So we go to East Europe. In East Europe, you've got Poles and Czechs and Hungarians, oh my. So you've got all these, like, you know, etc. You've all these Slavic tribes in Eastern Europe, or Slavic countries now in Eastern Europe, and, you know, they're Catholic countries. That's not too big a deal at this time. They're sort of off doing their thing. The Protestantism really doesn't really make it that far into the East. We'll talk more about what happens in Eastern Europe here. Germany. Germany ends up, the northern two-thirds of the Catholic, okay. The northern two-thirds of Germany basically ends up going Protestant, but the southern third of Germany ends up going Catholic. The southern third of Germany is very closely allied with Austria, and of course Austria had been the Habsburg family lands. So it's sort of, that southern third of Germany remains Catholic with the Habsburgs, who are down in Austria, and then the northern two-thirds of Germany goes Protestant, essentially. Okay, in Italy, well, do I need to say it?
Yeah.
Political families. So, you don't have to worry about Protestants down there in Italy, but you do have to worry about the competing Italian families with their competing political parties. Yeah, that's been the case for a long while now. Also, in Italy, you have to worry a little bit here because the French and the Habsburgs in Austria are sort of vying for control of northern Italy. So whenever France and Austria fight a war, they fight each other going through northern Italy. So the Pope now has to worry about that. Put this in perspective here. If anyone knows about the Galileo trial, the Galileo trial is happening during the 30 Years' War. Right, so the 30 Years' War, where France is funding Protestants to fight Catholic countries. The Barberini family, Urban VIII was from the Barberini family. The Barberini family was known for being soft on Protestantism. The Barberini family was known for sort of being like, look, let's just take care of Italy. You know, let's not worry about fighting the Protestants right now. So they were seen as weak on Protestantism. The Barberini family was also had close relations with the King of France. So there's a lot of politics going on behind the scenes of the Galileo trial here. You've got other families who are upset that are sort of more allied with the Habsburgs, and the Barberini family is more allied with the French, and the Barberini family's not wanting to be as aggressive going after Protestants in northern Germany. So lots of politics going on there. Okay. Outside Europe. All right. Let's hold on to outside Europe for a little bit. Because I need to talk about all the missionary activities then. 1648 to 1820. Yeah. So here you've got, in France, France develops a lot of political problems after the Treaty of Westphalia, and then heading more toward the 1820s. Because you end up having backers of the divine right monarchy who are fighting against the Continental Enlightenment movement. And in France, the Continental Enlightenment usually meant the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So I don't know if you're familiar with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but his big thing was that man is naturally born good, and that he is corrupted by society and hierarchical institutions. Thus, the way you encounter your true humanity and your true freedom is to destroy traditional institutions because they corrupt you. So, you've got the divine right monarchy. So in France, you've got this sort of back and forth between divine right people supporting the divine right monarchy versus sort of the Enlightenment ideas, and then finally in 1792, or actually 1789, the French Revolution begins, and the French Revolution caps off like a reign of terror that is stopped only by the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. So this sort of ends with Napoleon. So you've got divine right monarchy fighting against the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment guys finally get a hold of things during the French Revolution, and then Napoleon comes in as sort of an enlightened dictator to stop the reign of terror. So now, in France, you've got the church is kind of like, okay, we didn't like the divine right, we didn't like the divine right of kings, monarchs over there, but at the same time, we also really, really don't like the Enlightenment ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, who's the lesser of two evils here? So there's this big running debate in the church of, okay, are we going to try to buddy up with the monarchy because at least the monarchy wants to co-opt the church, they still want it around at least, whereas the Enlightenment guys are like, no, the church needs to be relegated to the ash heap of history. Yeah. Spain.
That's no way.
Yeah, just, in this time you sort of see a decline of the power of Spain. There's a sort of, Spain just sort of declines. Eventually they relinquish, in 1700 they relinquish control of the Inquisition. So in 1700 the Inquisition is let go of by the King of Spain. But Spain at this point is like really exhausted from everything it was doing in that period of time, that Spain's basically done as a first-rate power. So Spain's still really Catholic, but they can't do anything anymore. They're pretty much done. They're spent. And then, you know, when Napoleon comes in, Spain ends up fighting sort of like a mini civil war against itself during the age of Napoleon. Because on the one hand, they don't want the French to come in there and tell them how to do things. On the other hand, they sort of like the French rhetoric about equality and liberty and things like this over and against with the divine right monarchy. So you've got sort of a big thing happening there in Spain. England, this is really interesting. So Charles I becomes king. He's very high church Anglican. He marries a French princess who's a hardcore Catholic. The Puritans don't like this. So there ends up being a civil war in which Oliver Cromwell, wins the Civil War. Oliver Cromwell then basically tries to destroy what's left of anything high church Anglican. Nevertheless, anything that's even remotely high church Anglican, let alone Catholic. So it's under Cromwell that really the Catholic Church's back is kind of broken. Like the underground Catholic Church really rooted out under Cromwell. So Cromwell then dies without successor, because he basically reigned as a military dictator. And then Charles II, who was the son of Charles I, who was executed by Cromwell, he becomes king, but Charles II had lived most of his life in France. So he becomes king, and Charles II is allowed to become king on the stipulation that he has to be openly Protestant. So he says, okay, fine, I'll go become king, but he hears Catholic Mass privately his whole life. And then on his deathbed, he has a deathbed conversion to Catholicism. His brother, however, James II, converted to Catholicism as soon as his brother came back to England. And he wanted to gradually bring Catholicism back. That doesn't work. As a matter of fact, Parliament then has the 1688 Glorious Revolution where they ask him to leave, and they pass over 37 other people with closer bloodlines to the King of England who were Catholic to get to a Protestant person.
And don't they also make rules at that time saying that they have to be Protestant and they have to marry a Protestant woman?
Yeah.
You cannot marry any Catholic?
Yeah, so they pass, so under 1688, this is where you sort of get the limited monarchy in England, where you have, there's a Bill of Rights that the king can violate, the king can't do certain things, the king must be a member of the Church of England, whoever he marries must be a member of the Church of England, his household must be a member of the Church of England. Catholics are not allowed to carry weapons. So in English Bill of Rights, for example, it says, those subjects which are Protestant have a right to bear arms, but not those papists. Okay, so yeah. So then, so James II, 1688, that's when you sort of get Catholics really getting the shaft in England. Eastern Europe, wow, this is... So the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, etc., they're being jockeyed over by other major European powers. Austria, under the Habsburgs, who are Catholic. Sweden, they're Protestant. Russia, Eastern Orthodox, and the Ottoman Turks, who are Muslim. So you've sort of got, in Eastern Europe, you've sort of got this four-way partition of Eastern Europe going on, where each of these four countries are trying to figure out exactly how they're going to divide up the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, and the Bulgarians, and everybody else. So the churches, of course, here being like, well, we really don't want the Turks to get more control of Eastern Europe. We'd really like to contain Sweden, so really it's between Austria and Russia. The Eastern Orthodox are better than the Protestants, but we'd rather have the Austrians as their captain. So the church is sort of doing this thing where, okay, we want to give the Austrians our support, but at the same time, if the Austrians are weak and the Russians are stronger, we prefer the Russians over the Swedes, and the Swedes over the Turks. So, yeah, a lot of diplomatic maneuvering here. In Germany, the This is basically status quo. But starting at this time, of the northern German states, Prussia starts emerging as the leading Protestant German state during this period of time. Yeah. So Prussia is starting to like consolidate a lot of the northern German Protestant states, or at least pull them into their orbit. Italy, yeah, that's still happening. So again, you know, you're trying, so if you're the Pope, you're constantly trying to quell these ambitious Italian political families. No, 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 I'm not going to appoint your kid to be a cardinal. Fine, you're putting, okay, you're going to kill members of my family, okay, fine, he can be a bishop, but not a cardinal. Yeah. Man, okay, so now, during this period of time, we start to get like the big Catholic missionary endeavors. So, even while Catholicism is sort of, you know, fighting Protestantism in Europe, Catholicism is expanding exponentially on 3 other continents. So, in India, the Portuguese show up in India in the 1500s to discover that there have been Catholics there all along. Yeah, so one of the interesting things here is that they land basically in Goa, which is on the western coast of India. So if you know India, it looks kind of like that. Goa is right about there. The Portuguese land, and the Portuguese get off the boat, and the Portuguese chroniclers basically said, we get off the boat, and we were accosted by people trying to convert us to Christianity. They then inquired as to what the hell you guys are doing. And the Portuguese, so these Portuguese are getting there, and they inquire, and they say, and these local Indians who were living on the coast and were persecuted by like the other Indians who were Hindus, said, well, yes, you know, we've been here ever since we can remember. You know, like, oh, really? What's your deal? Yes, there was this guy named Thomas who came out here and taught us stuff. Thomas. Apostle Thomas? Yes. So the Portuguese landed in India in the 1500s to discover a whole enclave of people in India who claimed to have been evangelized by St. Thomas the Apostle. The Portuguese then say, really, show us this Thomas of the Apostle, and then the Indian people there that are living in Goa essentially take them to like a burial plot that 20 years ago was carbon dated, and there are the remains of someone who was from the 1st century. So they landed in this one particular part of India and discover that the Indians there had been claiming to have been evangelized by St. Thomas the Apostle. And they also claimed to have had contact with some of the Catholic churches that had been under Muslim rule as well. So they also claimed that they had contact with Christian enclaves in Persia that they had been in contact with, and they had claimed also that they had been in contact with the Chaldean Rite Catholics of Baghdad and places like that. So the Portuguese are basically like shocked. They show up in India and they're like, well, we landed on Mars and discovered that there are Catholics on Mars. So then eventually in the 1500s you start getting the Jesuits going to India to sort of expand, and the Jesuits, so if you look at all of these big missionary endeavors, most of the big missionary endeavors of the 15 and 1600s done by the Jesuits, and the Jesuits in internal church politics were very controversial for their successes and the way in which they went about things. So these are countries in which Jesuits had successful missions. So of course you got the North American Indians and you got South American. So in India, for example, the Jesuits sort of get off the boat there on the coast where you had the people who had been claiming to have been evangelized by St. Thomas. They would then go and the Jesuits would seek out the Brahmin caste of the Hindu caste system. The Brahmins were the priestly caste and they were also the highest caste. So what they would do is they would start by trying to evangelize Brahmins and say, well, you're priests, we're priests. And then they would try to like learn their language, and they would try to evangelize them about the caste system and things like that. So what the Jesuits, their common missionary tactic was that they would try to find aspects of overlap between Catholicism and whatever the local culture was, and try to say, look, we're just like you. You have these other things that are, like different from us, but we're just like you. And they would try to evangelize them, preserving as much of the local traditions as possible, as the local cultures as possible. Now, on the one hand, this is very successful for them. On the other hand, there were some Jesuits who would sort of be like, yes, Japan. Ancestor worship's totally okay. Sure, you can be Catholic and still worship your ancestors. And then so there were some times where they would run into problems. So in the case of India here, the Jesuits would often convert people by portraying themselves as the Brahmin equivalents of their culture. But then they, maybe wouldn't denounce the caste system as much, or they wouldn't denounce reincarnation and things like this. They would sort of say well, look, if we get them into the church, then in a couple of generations, then they'll give up the reincarnation stuff, they'll give up the caste system stuff. That was sort of their strategy. China. In China, the Jesuits were very successful in China because they would present themselves as Confucian-like teachers. Confucius, the big Chinese philosopher. Confucius's moral teachings are very similar to say, Aristotle's teachings, and Aristotle has a lot of overlap with Christianity. So what they would do is they would present themselves as intellectuals, and they would emphasize the similarities in moral teachings, and then say, well, gee, wouldn't it, our moral teachings are more compatible with our religion than your moral teachings are with the religions that you practice. So why, if you have these moral teachings, why wouldn't you want to become Christian instead? In Japan, they would present themselves as samurai. So the samurai being, the big, warrior, caste in Japan, and the Jesuits would show up and they would be like, well, we're the spiritual samurai of our culture. Isn't it better to be spiritual samurai than to be material samurai? Now in China and in Japan, they're very successful until they're so successful there's a counter-reaction by the monarchy, and the Emperor of Japan and the Emperor of China eventually, when they become too expansive, they just then chop their heads off. So so on the one hand, very successful in China and Japan. On the other hand, I guess, successful in, there end up being lots of martyrs who find their way to Christ. Not successful in the fact that you are really building up an institutional church there, you might say. Philippines, very successful though. Philippines, the Jesuits actually developed a strategy here where they would set up Jesuit command posts outside of Philippine villages, and then they would have duty rounds where they would identify where the Filipino villages were, and then they would have a rotation where each of the priests from their Jesuit base would sort of go out and do different things for the Filipino people and sort of say, oh, what do you need now? What do you need now? We'd be happy to teach you for a little bit. And this is actually, it was that system that actually was, they developed the first seismological studies, because the Philippines had lots of earthquakes. So on the one hand, this was very helpful in preserving the lives of Filipinos who thought that earthquakes were caused by the gods. And it was also helpful as an evangelization tactic, because if you could predict when the earthquakes would happen, you would be able to show them that gods are not actually controlling the earthquakes. In fact, there's only one God, and he has given us the light of knowledge to be able to know when earthquakes happen. So this is very successful in converting Filipinos. South America, Jesuits successful there in a wide variety of ways. One humorous example is if you go to Quito, Ecuador, they have this road called the Seven Churches, and each religious order has their own base cathedral there, and their own base for Ecuador, and their head house. And the Jesuits built theirs out of gold. Which you might say, a Jesuit building things out of gold? Well, for the Incas that were in that region, or the Incas believed that the sun was God, and that anything that was the color of the sun was like little pieces of God rained down on earth. So they built a church out of gold on the inside, so that when the Incas would walk in, they would either say, oh, because they worship the one God who was the sun, right? So the idea was like, so what the Jesuits say is like, look, you're doing a great job with the one God thing. You're just misunderstanding a little bit. Come in, we're just trying to make you feel comfortable with all the gold here. We'd be happy to tell you like what exactly you're misunderstanding here. On the other hand, right, you could also say, wow, if those guys can take little pieces of our God and make something grand out of it, then maybe these little pieces of things here aren't actually gods, aren't actually little pieces of God. Maybe there is something we're missing. Now we're going to be more likely to listen to what the Jesuits have to say. So the Jesuits here would sort of use little pieces of indigenous culture to evangelize them as a basis. They would often, let's see. The Jesuits also gained some credibility because the Jesuits had what were called set-asides. If the church claimed land under Spanish law, then the Spanish government was not allowed to send troops onto church territory. So what the Jesuits would do is that they would like go out into the vast wilderness where no Spanish government people had been before, and then they would just be like, we claim all this land here for the church. This is all church land. And then what they would do is they would go and find out exactly where the natives were, and they would build a Catholic church right smack in the middle of the natives' village to make it harder for the Spanish to go and enslave them. And then the natives would sort of be like, oh, that building over there can protect us from slavery? Yes, it can. Would you like to find out what's so great about the building? Why, sure, you're protecting us from slavery. Why wouldn't I want to hear about this? So that's another thing the Jesuits would do in South America, is they would go find out where the native tribes were before the Spanish slave traders got there. They then plunked down a church right in the middle of their village, and under Spanish law, they couldn't go on without the church's permission. So that was another thing that often happened. Oh, wow, I'm almost done. Well, the time's almost done. Okay. North America. Okay, well, in North America, a lot of the. So first off, you have lots of French Jesuit missionaries that are responsible for discovering a lot of different tribes in Canada and then down along the Mississippi. And then once you start to get American English colonies, you often have it's often Jesuits and other Catholic missionaries that are the ones going beyond the Appalachian Mountains who are trying to map out routes through the various desert areas or various rivers and things like that. So the first maps that we have of, say, the first maps we have in Louisiana Purchase from before Lewis and Clark are all from Jesuit missionaries. And then also you have in California, you have the system of Franciscan mission territories in California. So like all of the cities that are along the southern west coast of California, right? Those were all originally built around Franciscan missions
By the Spanish.
by the Spanish. So a lot of we see in North America here is a lot of the I guess the first natives to convert in North America converted as a result of either French missionaries who are mapping the undiscovered territory of the interior continent, or they're Franciscan missionaries who have set up bases in California, and that's where you get a lot of the first natives to convert to Christianity. Because a lot of the natives from California that end up converting, they're not really converting. You could make a case that in Mexico, right, there was like a high coercive incentive to convert, but in California that was not the case. At least certainly not as much a case. So so you have a lot of the initial discovery of the interior continent of North America done by Jesuits, and things like that. Okay, so So I guess next class I'll start with external to the church in the 1800s, and then I'll go to the internal disputes, internal politics of the church in this period of time. But the big thing I wanted to get across here is just what are a couple of the major themes that we see here between, say, the Council of Trent, politically between the Council of Trent and after the Napoleonic Wars. What are some common themes we see here?
The loss of church power.
Okay, so definitely the loss of political power for the church.
Yes.
What else?
A lot of infighting in families and all that kind of stuff. We'll see.
Okay, so you see.
I would say the breakdown, because under Catholic Europe, things were pretty calm. But
Yeah.
now it's free for all.
Yeah, so now you've got, as one of the fallouts of the Westphalian state system, or I guess one of the, not fallouts of the Westphalian state system, the Westphalian system actually kind of composes it a lot more than it otherwise would have been. But the, one of the things we get, once we get the Protestant Reformation happening, you now have a breakdown of Christendom, and what you get is all of these countries that are sort of playing a realist balance of power kind of game. Right. Notice all of these Catholic countries that you would think that they would be willing to cooperate, but no, they actually make things worse by, fighting with each other, by trying to do a balance of power game. And the funny thing is, it's not that Catholicism was like less compelling, because massive exponential expansion of missionary efforts outside of Europe. It's just for some reason in Europe, things are sort of at loggerheads. Other observations? Yeah.
No, just that what you see is the decline of the Catholic Church within that European pocket. But Matt did say that then the church overwhelmingly takes over consider the heretics or whatever.
Yeah, one of the things you'll see here is that, there are Protestant missionaries that go outside of Europe, and they're successful a little bit as well, but if you look at the major missionary successes off the continent of Europe, they really belong to Jesuits and Franciscans. Much more so, they made a lot more headway in places like in the 1500s and 1600s in North America, in South America, in Asia, than do a lot of the Protestant missionaries that go. Yeah.
Ken, is it safe to say that the dysfunctional family political things in Europe exacerbated that stuff because of the games being played?
I think you could definitely make a case for that. Yeah. If anything, you could argue that the dynastic problems in Europe were actually restraining and restricting the church more so than helping it expand, helping it bring new souls to Christ. Yeah.
Ken, welcome home. You did a great job. We missed you last week.
Well,
I'll see if I can get you a raise.
No, it's just it's just a lot. There's just a lot happening. I guess there's a lot happening in the aggregate. But if I did just one class on what's happening in France, it would take like 5 minutes. There's king and another king and there's another king and then there's Pope and there's the French Revolution, right? So it's one of those things where, if I take any one of these countries, it would, it's, for our purposes, you wouldn't be able to get a whole class on, just what's happening in Germany without getting into, like, they fought this battle. It was this many troops versus this many troops and things like that. So just for a political overview of the church, this is a lot of information. I really probably could have broken it down into 2 classes. Or maybe 3 classes, but I just wanted to sort of give you an overview. So next week we'll do 1820 to 1870, and then we'll get into what the internal disputes in the church were this time. So immediately after the French Revolution till Vatican I.